why don't we do things this way? I will make a few further remarks about this topic, and then we can go to the question and answer section. What we will do is you will ask your question. I'll repeat it as best I can so that we'll get on the tape. I'll ask you to nod if I articulated your question satisfactorily, and then we'll go on to the discussion. I don't want you to have to wait too long to ask some of these questions, because I know right after the talk, when the questions are fresh in the mind, is the best time to bring them up and to have a discussion of them. But let me just say a few more words about this orthodox understanding of near-death experiences and deathbed visions. One of the reasons, I think, why there is a suspicion of taking these things with too lightly a view, without being somewhat critical and doubting about them, is because, as you know, what happens in a lot of the talk show discussions about near-death experiences and deathbed visions is that everything is always peachy after someone's death. There's never anything negative. Everything is always life, love, joy, peace. It's always a reward for one's life. No one ever encounters some kind of, very dark, condemning kind of being after these visions that are discussed on these talk shows. As a matter of fact, there are texts where exactly that kind of things happen, but they're never discussed on Oprah or on Phil Donahue. Well, he's gone the way of all flesh, but whatever talk show you might watch. So it's one of the reasons we have to be careful about accepting all this hook, line, and sinker, is that because the secular apparatus of our culture often abuses and manipulates this data to give a very anti-Christian message to its audience. Okay? But here's the general principle in studying all of these facets of life after death. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. All right? Because we want to be careful and critical doesn't mean we want to dispense with all of this information as being totally irrelevant to a solidly orthodox understanding of death and afterlife. Okay? So, let me just make a few remarks about some of the imagery that the church uses about the state of the soul after death. These are things you're all familiar with. You've heard them in the services, and you've seen them on tombstones and whatnot. We will discuss these fully in the talks to follow, tomorrow and the 2 days following. What happens at death? Okay, the soul in separation from the body, according to the language of the fathers, enters a state of, and this is the term that's often used, slumber or sleep. All right? Death is called a falling asleep. Obviously, what feast in August is that term applied to the death of whom? The Theotokos, the dormition, the falling asleep of the Theotokos. This idea that death is a sleep of the body, and also that the soul enters a state of repose, of slumber. The repose, the slumber, is both of the body and the soul. Now, let me hasten to add, this is not the soul sleep of the Jehovah's Witnesses. All right? Where the soul ceases all perception. That's not what it is. It is a kind of self-reflective repose that the soul enters into after death. We're going to see that this is related to the Orthodox understanding of the soul's judgment after death. All right? I will tell this story, brief story, about a friend of mine who's a Roman Catholic nun. And she says that her order requires her every 7 years to take an extended silent retreat. What she has to do is go out into the wilderness. People should come to Alaska for these retreats that have plenty of space to do it. Living out in the wilderness by herself to make sure she has enough food, and they check in every once in a while to make sure she's okay. But she has a month in isolation. All right? And I said, boy, that sounds great. I could go for that. And she says, oh, it is great. The first day, it's wonderful. You just love the silence. And you love the peace. And the second day, you're really relaxed. And you're feeling like you're centered. Third day, you start to get a little nervous. And by the fourth day, for the rest of the month, she says, it is terrifying. Because without televisions, without newspapers, without people to talk to, without any kind of stimulus external to yourself, what do you end up doing? Turning inward. And that kind of self-assessment, which of course is the whole purpose of such a retreat, is the terrifying experience that we, even in the body, go through. All right? When we're isolated from that kind of sensory engagement with the world. What happens with the soul after its separation from the body, which after all is its means of interacting with the material world, there is a kind of reflective state that's entered into, which is something that we don't understand because obviously our souls are in our bodies right now. Okay? This kind of language of repose or slumber does not mean unconsciousness. It means consciousness of a different sort, a noetic consciousness. And that's why, this image of slumber or sleep occurs a lot, both in popular things. Well, for instance, what's on tombstones, rest in peace. That, of course, is, applied mostly to the body, but it also refers to this state of the soul in its reflective kind of repose. Where does the soul go? All right, we're going to look at this question much more carefully. Where does it go? Of course, the prayers of the church talk about this in terms of spatial imagery. One goes up or down. All right? These are images. By the way, one of the things that we should not confuse is serious reading of a text with pure literalism. Somehow, maybe this comes from a fundamentalist Protestant atmosphere in the United States, but we tend to think that unless we're interpreting a text literally, we're not really getting its true meaning. It's fudging on the issue, so to speak. That's not true. Sometimes texts are meant to be seen as imagery, and the imagery itself is meant to be interpreted as precisely that, imagery and metaphor. To understand the text properly, you must understand that they're using this imagery to convey a truth that is not to be read literally. You don't read the New York Times as poetry, and you don't read poetry as the New York Times, unless you're really a fan of the New York Times, but you get my point. Different genres of literature are meant to be read in different ways. The imagery that the church uses in describing the experience of the soul after death uses a lot of spatial imagery of up and down. Now, I'm not saying that's all something to be dispensed with because it's just figurative. On the contrary, I think it's something to be looked at much more closely because what is being conveyed there through this language. Okay? But I want to make that point. In other words, what the soul enters after death is a spiritual reality without spatial coordinates, if I can use that kind of language. It's entering a spiritual reality without spatial coordinates. That way you don't get into, most of you are too young, but some of us older people will remember when the Soviets sent Sputnik up, remember? And they said, we've proved that there's no God because we've gone into the sky, far above the earth. We didn't meet any God. You see, this kind of stupid literal reading of a text, made them, but there are some people who are convinced by that kind of argument because that's the way they understood this language. Okay. So, the soul enters a spiritual reality without spatial coordinates. And what it enters into is a state of relationship with God, where God is clearly perceived through this noetic awareness. So what we're dealing here is a state of relationship in a spiritual reality, and to show that that relationship is somehow a process of development. Now, note this. To show that the soul, after its separation from the body, enters into a spiritual reality, which is a relationship with God, that relationship is a process. How is that process reflected in the imagery? Through a movement, the soul's movement through various stages. All right? Now, the purpose of this spatial imagery and movement through spaces, the journey of the soul, so to speak, which, by the way, is cross-cultural. You find this in sacred texts cross-religiously, is meant to convey what this new spiritual existence, this state of reality is. And we're going to look at that more carefully, too. Also, one thing that the church teaches consistently, forcefully in the imagery used in its liturgical texts is that after the soul is separated from the body, it goes through a period of assessment, to use the technical term of judgment. All right? There is a judgment of the soul after death. There are very stark images of angels and demons in the prayers. For instance, in the office of the parting of the soul from the body. Some of the imagery is startling, where the soul prays that these visions do not dissuade it, do not mislead it, do not take it from its proper concentration. There is talk of, as you all know, a particular judgment that happens with the soul at the moment of the individual's death. All right? And sometimes you have this process of judgment described as a taxation of the soul. And many of you have probably heard even the more image-laden language, the language of toll houses or toll booths. Okay? Now, I am not in favor of saying this is all mythological language that's influenced by Gnosticism and should be just tossed out. I don't believe that. This is part of the tradition of the church. And we're going to look at this in what I think is the orthodox fashion of interpretation. In other words, all this language of toll houses and all this language of angels and demons and so forth, is it to be taken as a literal description of what happens, or is it meant to convey through figurative language a very balanced and very sort of spiritually sophisticated understanding of the process of judgment of the soul after death? We're going to look at that as well. And also in the writings of the fathers who write on this subject, and also in the prayers, you have the idea of the soul tasting of its eternity, enjoying a foretaste of its state. And we're going to see that in Orthodox eschatology, even after the soul is separated from the body, the focus of judgment is always on the last day, the final judgment, when Christ returns in glory and God is all in all. But between that state of the individual's death and the dawning of the last day, there is this foretaste of that soul's fate, eternal fate. And so we'll discuss that as well. This gives you some of the imagery that I wanted to sort of mention. And what we're going to do in talks to follow is unpack this imagery and the materials that we get both from the patristic writings and from the liturgical text and discuss what they mean. Literalism, let me say this once and for all, and I'm glad this is on tape. Do not think that you're being more faithful and true to what a text says if you only use a literal interpretation. By the way, it's a very unpatristic way of reading a biblical text. Read it only at the literal level. Sometimes text has to be read with careful attention to the imagery. And this kind of Protestant fundamentalist knee-jerk reaction, and unless you're reading a text literally, you're really doing violence to it, is simply not true. All right? So sometimes the position that's labeled as the most traditional is the most anti-traditional, because it violates the very purpose of the text that it's based on. So, just to sum up, there is something profoundly unnatural and wrong about death in the Orthodox understanding. Understood by the individual's experience, it is a trauma of sorts that is a reflection of a much larger cosmic problem. God didn't create death, but God defeats it. And the purpose of salvation focuses in on this phenomenon, the human experience of death and the cosmic experience of death, and overturns it. The process of salvation that we're all engaged in has as its purpose the restoration of creation without this taint, without this corruption of death. So we will look at these topics in a very sort of systematic fashion in the talks to follow. And we can even get started on some of that tonight, but I want to take questions first, because I know some of you have questions about these things, and let's start with them. Yes, sir.
You mentioned a state of slumber or repose.
Mm-hmm.
The person that dies in 20 AD as opposed to 2020
Mm-hmm.
AD, does that mean it's going to be 2,000 years of repose for the one person and only
Very good question.
5 years?
Okay, very good question. Let me restate it and see if I'm saying it faithfully. What if someone died in 20 AD and someone dies in 2020 AD? And say that the Lord returns in, 2050 AD. Is that person who's been slumbering since 20 AD have this sense of a long kind of slumber, a sense of the passage of, millennia before the Lord's return, as opposed to the person who dies in 2020 only has to wait 30 years? I mean, in other words, is the slumber of the person who died long ago a much more tormenting and sort of stretched out experience than the person who dies more recently? The answer to that question, I think, would be this, that when the soul is in separation from the body, it enters into a realm of timelessness. It doesn't have the sense of the passage of time. One of the images that I heard one of my spiritual fathers use, I like very much. He says, death is a rest after a long day's work. And we've all had the experience, haven't we? That we go to bed, and as soon as you set the alarm clock for the next morning, as soon as you put your head to the pillow, it seems like the thing has rung. All right? This is the way that, the best image that he could give for showing how those who pass into this realm of timelessness in anticipation of the last day don't have this idea that, oh, gee, I've been waiting around for 2 millennia, and this person has been waiting for only 30 years. There's not that sense of the passage of time. So, the idea is that the last day, when it dawns, will be an alarm that rings, awaking both those who have just entered into their repose of death and those who have been there for a long time. I don't know about you, but when I'm really tired, I don't have that sense of the passage of time in the night. I wish I did, because I say, I'm so tired of sleeping. It's time to get up. Believe me, that never happens. Yes.
A quick factual question. Who publishes that book, Life After Death, by Vlachos?
Yes, it's published. It's translated by a woman named Esther Williams, I assume not the swimmer. And it's available in this country from an address that I can give you afterwards, okay? Because, by the way, I really am a fan of Metropolitan Erotheos. I think he's one of the most balanced, patristically sound contemporary writers around. And he's so nuanced in his arguments and so thoroughly respectful of opposing opinions when he describes them and discusses them, that his books really, he has this remarkable ability to bring a patristic mindset to thoroughly contemporary questions. And he is really someone that you should read. In fact, I think the latest issue of Again magazine has an article by him about balancing sacramental and ascetical life. Notice the spirit of his writing. He wants to value ascetical life. He wants to value sacramental life. But what's the question? How to integrate them and make them work in the Orthodox life. It's great. I mean, his writing is wonderful. Yes?
The other part was not quite so simple. Going back to your non-equation that you had on the board.
Right.
Soul versus body is not to be equated with spirit versus flesh. I'm sorry, that is not entirely clear to me. Why are we not to equate them?
Because it gives an let me repeat the question. The non-equation I gave, why we're not to equate body versus soul with the biblical talks about flesh versus spirit, especially in St. Paul's writings. Because what it has tended to do in Christian spirituality throughout the centuries, it's led to a devaluation of the body. What really matters is the spiritual, the immaterial, the soul versus the body. And this is, as I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow, we always hear this term Gnostic being bantied about. I want to show you how the Gnostic worldview in many ways, even though it has been, Gnosticism was really one of the major heresies fought by the early church from the beginning days, and it has not yet disappeared. It is alive and well. And the fathers knew that this was the arch enemy of Christianity. And they did their best. You read Irenaeus, you read some of the other earliest fathers. They were masterful at assailing the Gnostics. And yet, Gnosticism persists. And one of the ways it persists is that people devalue the body as the object of God's care and salvation and think that the proper process of salvation is just for the soul alone, the spirit, and not for the body. Not so. You will spend eternity in a body. Okay? But more about that later. Yes. Very good question. Yes. Okay. Now the question was, these souls after death in a state of noetic awareness, how much does that noetic awareness make them aware of what's going on earth, for instance, with us here and now? And what about the saints? Are they in that state of noetic awareness as well? Good. I will discuss this more fully when we get to the fourth talk, I think. But let's look at it this way. If I can use an image that's not sophisticated, but bear with me. What unites all of us together, okay, is living and dead, by the way. Those who die in Christ are not separated from us. They are still united with us in the body of the living, risen Christ. What connects us with them? What connects us in the living body of Christ is the Holy Spirit. Okay? In that, these souls repose in the presence of God in the Spirit, and we are in that Spirit. I think there's an awareness of a link, awareness of being joined in one body of the risen Christ. So living and dead have an awareness of that. This is why I've always thought it very peculiar in a lot of folk traditions and a lot of our ethnic churches. People would say, "Oh, Father, Thank you for the funeral. We'll see you at the mercy meal, and then I won't see you until the 40-day memorial. The idea was, because they were in mourning, they stayed away from church. I said, this is the time when you should be coming to church, because the union that soul fills with the living is especially potent, I would think, when we are all praying in the Spirit, especially in that apex of worship, namely the divine liturgy. The idea of the iconography of the church, showing us, living icons, surrounded by the icons of the saints on the church, this is not just meant to be a pretty way to decorate a church. It's meant to convey a reality that, joined by the Spirit, the living and the dead are united to one another in one body and can be spiritually aware of each other. And the saints, I would say, because of their intensity of participation in the Holy Spirit, these are especially accessible to our prayers, receptive of our prayers, because they are especially attentive to what the Spirit conveys to them by virtue of our prayers in the Spirit. This is one way I would explain how we're all connected, and there is an awareness of the presence of the other. Okay? So I think that's one way of looking at it. The Holy Spirit unites us all in this living reality, and there is awareness of a link one with the other. Okay? Yes?
I'm curious how Orthodoxy would view the traditional biological view of what death is all about.
Uh-huh.
In simpler organisms like an amoeba, it just separates. There's no death of the individual.
Right.
Death doesn't enter into it from a biological point of view until there's sexual reproduction. At which point, then life is carried on with the offspring, but the parental organism dies.
Right. Okay. This is a very interesting question. One I had never been asked before, I never thought about. So it's a very great question. The biological view, that death really enters the scene only when, in the, process of biological development, sexual reproduction enters into the world. In other words, amoebas, just divide. Okay? And they keep dividing. But what happens when higher organisms develop sexual reproduction, there's the death of the parent and living on of the child. Okay? It's an interesting thought, and I would say that in many ways, in a secular understanding of immortality, this is what a lot of secularists have boiled immortality down to. I die, but I live on in my children. Okay? That I continue to exist because I have children and grandchildren and so forth. I've heard many secular atheists, unbelievers say this, that this is their understanding of immortality. Here's two observations I would bring to that. First of all, the amoeba that divides, not every amoeba lives forever. I mean, even amoebas die in time.
It can be destroyed.
Right.
I don't think it dies of old age.
It doesn't die of old age, okay? But it is destroyed. It can be destroyed and lose its existence. Right. Listerine can be used or something. And what happens once too, and we're going to see what the focus of Orthodox eschatology is that the awareness, the self-awareness of the human being, the ability of the soul to reflect, of the nous to connect and transcend beyond itself. This puts human beings in a completely different category from other beings. And this is really the focus of the Orthodox understanding of the afterlife. In other words, the nous. Animals have souls. They don't have rational souls with the nous, but they have their living bodies. Okay? But there's something different about the human ability to transcend oneself and to reflect on one's morality, so to speak. One's conscience is what we call it. And this is what sets human immortality apart from these other biological kinds of immortality. All right, so I think that this is the way Orthodoxy, unlike a lot of modern contemporary sort of trendy secular philosophies, does not see every life form as equal. We do have a hierarchy of being in the Orthodox view, and the apex of creation is the human being, which is not to say we should disrespect or destroy, quote unquote, lower forms of life. But the Orthodox anthropology states what makes us different is the fact that we have conscience and the ability to transcend ourselves and to be self-reflective. This is what makes a big difference. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. We have a time or period of judgment at the time of death or short after death. What's the big deal about a final judgment?
Okay, good question. If we have a judgment, a particular judgment after death, what's the big deal about the final judgment, the judgment of the last day? This is a very good question, and I'll just make a brief response to it because I'll discuss it more fully when we get there. The fathers have a good sense of justice. Here's what they say. They say the self-reflective judgment of the soul after the individual's death is determined by what you did while that soul was in the body. It therefore only stands up as fair that the whole person, body and soul, the body in which you sinned or grew in the spiritual life, should be subject to judgment as well. In other words, judgment is properly focused on the whole person. And so what the soul is experiencing is not the whole shebang. What is the whole shebang is when the person, body and soul together, stands for judgment, as is only fair, because that soul in that body worked toward salvation or lost salvation by virtue of the choices it made while in the body. So I'll say more about why the resurrection of the body is such a central aspect of this. Okay? And why the last day, therefore, is the focus. Yes, Chris. Uh-huh.
What we're saying this evening is really, heaven is really not yet.
That's right. All right, the question that was asked was, in his Protestant upbringing, he had the idea that once one died, one was ushered immediately into heaven, or conversely, ushered immediately into hell. And that was it. No need to worry about what was going to happen on the last day because the judgment's already sealed. In this, Orthodox eschatology stands apart because we do believe that, yes, you do have a judgment going on and a foretaste of what's going to be your eternal fate, but nothing is sealed until the last day when, as a person, you stand for judgment. So I'd say, yes, this is a big difference from not only, the view you were given growing up, but the view most of us were given in growing up. I'd say this is a pretty widespread. The last judgment sort of loses its importance almost in the way people think about death. I mean, once you've died and you're judged, the last judgment is sort of like an afterthought. But in Orthodox eschatology, it's the centerpiece, not the afterthought. And everything is built around it. Yes, sir?
More words about prayer and intercession.
Yes, I will. This one I'll definitely delay on because the third talk is going to go through a very systematic view of what we do for the dead, what we should do in praying and interceding for the dead, and why it has the effect it does. And some of the different images that are used in explaining the efficacy of prayer for the dead. Look, prayer for the dead is something that went on even before Christianity appeared on the scene. Jews, for instance, pray for their departed. Now, how you understand the efficacy of prayers for the departed is something we'll discuss very fully because this is a big difference. I mean, I always get very uneasy sometimes when I go to Protestant funerals where you remember the dead, you celebrate their life, all the things they accomplished, but you never once pray for the dead. And I'm never thinking there's like something missing. You should be praying for this person. Not only, so you go to a funeral and the funeral is a celebration of the life of the person, which indeed is a good thing. But there's also a duty. We have certain duties toward the dead, and we'll discuss that fully. But you're right on target with asking that question because that's really, this is what we have to know, what our duties are and how we fulfill them well. Khudi, you had a question?